Do you have a moment? It's about your mother-in-law, the doctor said, looking very worried as he pulled on my arm. It's been 10 years since my mother-in-law started using a wheelchair. She regularly goes to the hospital for checkups and physical therapy. On that day, she was there for tests and I was waiting in the waiting room. Suddenly, a doctor grabbed my arm and said, "I'm going to talk to her main doctor about this." I gently pulled my arm away. The doctor talking to me was a man, but my mother-in-law's main doctor is a woman. I hadn't heard about any changes to her doctor, so I was confused about why this man wanted to talk about her. Seeing the confusion in my eyes, the male doctor quickly grabbed my hands and said, "There's something neither your mother-in-law nor her main doctor should hear. That's why I want to tell you only." "Only me?" I asked, stepping closer to him. The doctor looked very serious. "My name is Julie. I'm a 37-year-old office worker at a small company. I've been working from home lately. When I was a child, my mother left us, so I was raised by my father. He always said bad things about her, calling her a bad woman who ran off with a younger man. He told me never to meet her. All I knew was her name, Yvonne, and that she spent too much money. She treated me and my father poorly. They eventually divorced, and my father worked very hard so I could go to college and get a job, even if it wasn't at a big company. Despite not having a mother, I never felt lonely because of my father's love. After I started working, I lived on my own and became independent. 14 years ago, I married Mike. His father had died 2 years before our wedding, and his mother, who lived alone, welcomed me warmly, treating me like her own daughter. 4 years into our marriage, my mother-in-law was in a car accident and started using a wheelchair. She used to be lively and cheerful, but after the accident, she stopped smiling and became very withdrawn. It must be hard for her to accept her limited mobility. Over the years, she had various caregivers, but none were a good match, and she seemed to get worse. She often contacted us, saying she felt lonely and wanted us to visit, even if only for a short time. Worried about her, we decided to move back into his family home to take care of her. We took a week off from work to focus on her care, planning to return to our jobs once she felt better. My mother-in-law seemed relieved when we visited, and after a few days, she started smiling again. However, when we told her we needed to get back to work, her mood changed drastically. She cried out, nearly hysterical, "No, please, both of you, don't leave me alone." Trying to calm her, I said, "Look, Mike really needs to get back to his job, but I'll talk to my company and see if I can stay here a bit longer. I'll come back as often as I can. Just hang in there for me." She replied, "Julie, if you can stay, that would be great. Mike, you better come back, okay? I'll be waiting." After her husband's death, my mother-in-law had been alone for a long time. When we visited as a couple, she was overjoyed. Our sudden news of leaving probably made her anxious and confused. Her weakened state over the past week likely made her more fearful of being alone. After discussing with my company, I decided to switch to remote work and stay at home for a short time to care for her until she felt calmer. But ever since then, she hated being alone. Even when I worked from home, she was always clinging to me. No matter how close we were, I couldn't let my coworkers see her. Even if I asked her to leave the room, she'd always be somewhere she could see me. It felt like I was being watched, and I began to resent it. Mike, on the other hand, would come home on weekends and even take some days off during the week to help with her care. She continued physical therapy, but there was no improvement in her condition, which meant I couldn't return to the office. Our personal lives were dominated by her care, leaving no time for just the two of us. This year marks the 10th year of this lifestyle. She turned 65, and with each passing year, her dependency on us grew. My husband, unable to bear it, reduced his visits year by year. Even if I stepped out for just a few minutes, my mother-in-law would freak out, yelling, "Take me with you." Calming her down took ages, and I couldn't go back to our own home. But I couldn't abandon the woman who had welcomed me from a single-parent household without any judgment or prejudice. Then one day, everything changed. On this day, my mother-in-law had a routine checkup. As always, I accompanied her to the hospital. My mother-in-law's doctor was a woman in her 30s named Maya. She had been taking care of my mother-in-law for 10 years, and I trusted her completely. After my mother-in-law went into the examination room, I stepped outside to take a work call. When I returned about 15 minutes later, a young male doctor stopped me. "Excuse me, you're Sally's daughter, right?" Sally is my mother-in-law's first name. The doctor who called out using my mother-in-law's name was a bit younger than me. His name was Ryan, and he had recently transferred to this hospital. He mentioned that he worked in the same department as Dr. Maya, who had been in charge of my mother-in-law. Taken aback, I replied, Yes, actually, I'm her daughter-in-law. But what's going on? Well, I'm sorry for the sudden approach. Do you have a moment? I need to discuss something about your mother-in-law. Sure, what's up? I figured my mother-in-law's appointment probably wasn't over yet, so I agreed. Dr. Ryan looked a bit relieved and led me to a small private room. It was a consultation room not too far from the examination rooms. Dr. Ryan motioned for me to sit in a chair on the side, and once I settled in, he took a seat across a small desk, looking directly into my eyes. You're currently living with Sally at her house to take care of her, right? Oh, yes, that's right, I explained. For the past 10 years, I had been working from my mother-in-law's home while caring for her. I hardly had time to hang out with friends, let alone spend time with my husband. Because of my mother-in-law's increased dependency, my husband started avoiding coming home. I lost almost all of my personal time and couldn't really discuss my frustrations with anyone else. Dr. Ryan nodded, listening intently, which made me spill all the frustrations I'd been feeling. Oh, I'm so sorry for going on and on like this, I said. He replied, it's completely all right. Wow, 10 years, he said with a gentle smile. Then his face grew thoughtful. Moments later, Dr. Ryan looked at me with a serious expression and started talking. However, before I could hear his words, I heard a scream from my mother-in-law. In a panic, Dr. Ryan and I rushed to the examination room. What we saw was unthinkable. I was at a loss for words. Dr. Ryan shook his head and said, you should leave that house as soon as possible. Get away from your mother-in-law. His words left me speechless. Suppressing the anger that welled up inside me, I nodded to Dr. Ryan. Instead of going to my mother-in-law, I headed straight to the police. Though skeptical they'd listen, they promised to send someone to investigate. I hurriedly packed up my things from the house. The image of what I'd seen at the hospital kept replaying in my mind. An hour or so later, as I was still packing, I called my husband to explain everything. Throughout, I kept receiving countless calls and messages from my mother-in-law. She must have been worried since I didn't show up after her treatments. I continued to ignore her nonstop calls and messages until I was mostly finished packing. In the evening, my husband and the police arrived, and that's when I finally answered a call from my mother-in-law. Julie, where are you? I've called so many times. Why aren't you picking up? She yelled with fury. Normally, I'd apologize immediately, but this time I responded firmly, I'm at home. Why did you leave me behind and go home first? How could you do that? My mother-in-law continued to rant. Sighing, I said, hey, I realized I don't need to live with you anymore, so I'm going back to the house where my husband is. Julie, what on earth are you thinking? How do you expect me to live without you? How am I supposed to get back from the hospital? You probably know best, right? Why don't you just walk back home? After all, your legs are fine, so you don't need a wheelchair or care, right? When I said that, my mother-in-law let out a short scream. I could picture her being extremely upset. I found out everything you've been hiding. I then told my mother-in-law what Dr. Ryan had explained to me and what I had witnessed. According to Dr. Ryan, recent tests showed there were no issues with the muscles or nerves in my mother-in-law's body. He thought it might be psychological. Maybe she genuinely believed she couldn't walk, and that belief was stopping her from walking. He mentioned the power of such beliefs can be incredibly strong. Dr. Ryan was considering not only physical therapy for her legs, but also psychological care. That's why he had included me in the care plan. But even that wasn't necessary. While I was talking to Dr. Ryan, we heard a woman scream from the examination room. Dr. Ryan and I exchanged glances and quickly went to check. Through the window in the door, we saw my mother-in-law making gestures as if swatting away an insect. Indeed, the scream had been my mother-in-law's, but why would there be a bug in the exam room? It turned out she had mistaken dust for a bug. We watched as she picked up the dust and walked to the trash can to throw it away. Incredibly, my mother-in-law walked without needing a wheelchair or cane, moving lightly. I stared in shock as Dr. Ryan pushed me to the corner of the hallway. Peeking into the examination room, we saw that my mother-in-law didn't seem aware of us. She calmly returned to her wheelchair as if nothing had happened. Just then, Dr. Maya came back into the room and extended her hand to my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law, seemingly in response, placed a brown envelope in her hand. Dr. Maya discreetly slipped the envelope into her skirt pocket and, acting as if nothing unusual had happened, pushed my mother-in-law's wheelchair towards the physical therapy facility. Julie, are you okay? Dr. Ryan asked softly. I was so stunned by the events that I could only stand frozen. It wasn't that my mother-in-law couldn't walk or even believe she couldn't. She was pretending to be immobile. Trembling, I felt Dr. Ryan's hand on my shoulder. Shaking his head gently, he advised me to leave my mother-in-law's house immediately. I quickly packed to escape. Throughout my story, my mother-in-law remained silent. Finally, with a sigh audible over the phone, she began to speak, perhaps realizing she couldn't evade the truth any longer. It's true that I became wheelchair-bound after a car accident, and it's true. I was injured seriously enough to need care, but thanks to the treatments, about 5 years after the accident, I could walk with the help of a cane. My husband and I, listening over the speaker, were stunned. To think she had recovered in just 5 years, what then was the purpose of the 12 years we had spent caring for her? I feared that once you both found out I could walk, you'd leave my side. Julie, Mike, I couldn't bear that thought, she said. We knew she loved us dearly from her day-to-day attitude. She had us take care of her to ensure we wouldn't leave. Julie, I truly love you like my own daughter. After Mike moved out and my husband passed away, I felt so lonely, my mother-in-law repeated, but our hearts remained unmoved. We knew that, Mom, Mike said, but the way you went about it was wrong. We can't be by your side any longer. Sorry. Look, I've been taking care of you for the past 10 years while working. My colleagues have experienced promotions, marriages, and childbirth. Because of your care, I couldn't have a child of my own. I had almost given up on having kids, but now I feel like the past 10 years aren't in vain. Why did you deceive us to the point of having us care for you? We would have visited you during our time off. Why did it have to be this way? I didn't mean to blame her, but as the words poured out, so did my tears. With my husband supporting me, I told my mother-in-law that I didn't intend to care for her anymore. We would leave her house today and never contact her again. My mother-in-law protested and grew hysterical, but we hung up. The police, after understanding the details, said they'd begin an investigation. 2 months later, after moving, I was at a hospital with my husband. We were about to leave after finishing our doctor's appointment when a familiar person rushed over to us. It was Dr. Maya, who was supposed to be my mother-in-law's doctor. We remembered her with fuller cheeks, but she looked gaunt and fatigue emanated from her entire being. Wondering why she was at this hospital, we couldn't decline her as she approached with a desperate look, so we reluctantly listened to what she had to say. It turned out Dr. Maya knew all along that my mother-in-law's leg was healed, and she had accepted money from her to give her a disability diagnosis. Dr. Maya mentioned that the money was also in the envelope she received from my mother-in-law that day. Apparently, due to a complaint by Dr. Ryan, the hospital found out, and she was fired immediately. Furthermore, since she had continuously forged medical certificates, she was likely going to be arrested for fabricating medical records, and her medical license was almost certain to be revoked. But she insisted that she didn't do anything wrong. Incredibly, Dr. Maya claimed that the money wasn't an appreciation gift for my mother-in-law, but hush money for my husband and me. She alleged that we had plotted to scam disability pension by making my mother-in-law disabled and that she had written the necessary documents reluctantly after we threatened her and paid her off. There was no evidence of any of this. It was Dr. Maya who extended her hand to my mother-in-law that day. I couldn't believe that she put all the blame on us just because she was in trouble and about to be arrested. What are you talking about? We haven't done anything like that, I exclaimed. No, that's the truth. I'm going to tell police everything, Dr. Maya shouted, her eyes red with rage, making us turn pale. While her claims had no evidence, it would also be tough for us to prove our innocence. Terrified at the thought of being demanded to prove our innocence, my husband and I were on the verge of tears when a woman approached us. She stood between Dr. Maya and us, shielding us. Aren't you the head doctor here? I urgently need to talk to you, the woman said sternly. Upon seeing the woman, Dr. Maya turned deathly pale. She quickly put on a forced smile and approached, trying to butter up the woman who was glaring at her. Do you need something from my daughter? Daughter? The woman asked, glaring at Dr. Maya. The woman glaring at Dr. Maya was Yvonne, my mother. Yes, my mother, whom I was separated from as a child due to her divorce from my father, was a doctor. After divorcing my father, she quickly rose through the ranks and became the head of a major university hospital. She was also one of the people who agreed with revoking Dr. Maya's medical license when she found out about her misdeeds. Oh, you're related. In that case, could you please just hear me out? I was only threatened by them and wrote the diagnosis reluctantly. As a mother, you wouldn't want your daughter to be a criminal, right? Can't you help me out? Dr. Maya begged, trying to invoke my mother's sympathy right then and there. But my mother shook her head firmly. Don't mess with me. You and Sally have been deceiving the hospital and the authorities for 10 years. Keeping my daughters confined at home, Sally kept them at home because she was afraid to be alone. You, on the other hand, funded your debts from your nightlife with Sally's disability benefits. Dr. Maya's plea for justice was quickly rejected. She felt hopeless and sank to the ground in despair. People around us stared and whispered, making us feel uneasy. Suddenly, my father-in-law approached angrily, demanding to know what happened to Julie. I was surprised to see him with my mother-in-law. They had been secretly dating, which I discovered last year. I hadn't told my father our new address partly because of this secret relationship. My father's intense reaction to seeing them together made me confront him. I revealed that the stories he told me about my mother were lies. He had painted her as a bad person to keep me from wanting to meet her. In reality, my mother, a busy doctor, had always sent support money and tried to stay in touch, but my father hid her letters and made excuses to prevent us from meeting. It turned out my father had left us after their divorce, not my mother abandoning us as he claimed. Despite my mother's efforts, my father manipulated the situation to keep us apart for years. It turned out my father's ability to afford our lifestyle and education came from the child support my mother sent over the years. When confronted with proof from my mother's bank app, my father couldn't deny it. My mother-in-law tried to console him, but I saw through their lies and decided to cut ties with them. Leaving the hospital, my mother and I started rebuilding our relationship. Meanwhile, Dr. Maya faced legal consequences for forging medical documents and lost her license. My mother-in-law also faced charges for fraud and bribery, including repaying pension money with interest. Mike, my husband, decided to distance himself from her. The betrayal left me emotionally shaken, so I've been seeing a therapist while adjusting back to work. During a referral at my previous hospital, I coincidentally met my mother, who now supports me discreetly. Despite the challenges, I find comfort in reconnecting with my mother and receiving support from my husband and Dr. Ryan, who turned out to be an old friend of my husband's. Now, I'm focusing on healing and enjoying life again, planning trips and outings with loved ones.